Hello, you are listening to or watching the podcast, Why You Do What You Do. The podcast that talks about human development and psychology. So last time we were talking about psychosocial development, good old Erik Erikson, and talking about how we develop, in a context of, the society. And we're going to pick up on that. Erickson's, oh gosh, Erickson's theory had held up better than Freud's, especially in its emphasis on the importance of social and cultural influences and on development beyond adolescence. Because as you remember, some of Freud's stuff delved a little too far down the sexual rabbit hole. um, Although his psychoanalysis was good, and he came up with that. Some of the other stuff, not so much. But Erikson built on his work and has come up with this theory. However, some of Erikson's concepts, like Freud's, do not lend themselves to rigorous testing. But it's important that we have these guys, because then one would come along and build on the other one's work. One would come along and build on another one's work. And that's how we got to have modern psychology. Perspective 2, learning. Whereas psychoanalysts are concerned with unconscious forces, proponents of the learning perspective are concerned with observable behaviors. Behaviors that, we can see. We see how children learn. Excuse me, I have allergies, and today's one of them days. It's hot here, and it's just acting up. These theorists maintain that development results from learning. And we grow as we learn. We develop our psyche and attitudes about everything as we learn things. A long-lasting change in behavior based on experience, or adaptation to the environment. So again, kids, your parents have experience that you don't have. So you might want to listen to them, because even a broken clock's right twice a day. And adaptation to the environment. Now, if you had a good environment, then you didn't have to adapt a whole lot. If you had a bad environment, you may have developed some maladaptive habits, or schemas to get along in that environment, because that's where you found yourself. So in order to survive, you had to develop these ways of being. And I have said before that I believe once you turn 18, you should just go to a psychologist or a counselor or whoever, and just get it over with. Because we all develop these, childhood ways of dealing with things. And sometimes they're not good. And they can cause you problems in other places in life. Learning theorists are concerned with finding out the objective laws that govern changes in observable behavior. Because we all grow and we all change. So they want to figure out, is there a set, way that this happens? Is it, are there laws of nature governing how this happens? And apply equally to all age groups. Because we know that, now, once you hit 18, you're just not automatically adult, and that's who you are forever. We know that there are different stages now, and you're always growing and learning, or at least you should be. So, they wanted to figure out if this is a constant, thing. They see development as continuous, not in stages, and emphasize quantitative change. Because there's a lot of changes that happen between the time you're a baby and the time you pass away. Learning theorists have helped to make the study of human development more scientific and less, abstract, like, Freud. Their terms are defined precisely, and their theories can be tested in the laboratory. And that's the key there. A lot of people think that psychology is still all philosophy. Oh, they think this or whatever, and they don't know. Well, modern day psychology, they do know, because they've tested their theories in laboratories with, sometimes not volunteers, which is kind of shameful in my book, and sometimes volunteers. And that's how, they learned about the science of psychology and the human mind and how we develop. By stressing environmental influences, they help explain cultural differences in behavior. Because like I said, you grow up in a certain environment, and our culture is not the same as the culture in South America would be. Theirs is not the same as a French Canadian culture would be. Theirs is not the same as a Scottish culture would be. So, we all grow up in a different setting, in a different culture, and that affects how we feel about things, how we, worship, how we think about things, and what we do, what we eat, what we wear. So that's a lot of variables from, place to place. Two important learning theories are behaviorism and social learning theory. All right, behaviorism. It's a mechanistic theory which describes observed behavior as a predictable response to experience. In other words, this happens, so now we think this is going to happen. Although biology sets limits on what people do, behaviorists view the environment as much more influential. Because your environment does influence you. You can't take a person out of an environment and suddenly they're totally different. Children learn what they live. What you grew up with, what you learned, the environment you were in affects you. And it affects your behavior. Sometimes, unfortunately. They hold that human beings at all ages learn about the world the same way other organisms do, by reacting to conditions or aspects of their environment. And that's how anything that is alive behaves. Your environment does affect you, what's going on in it. If fish find this area of water is not clean and good to breathe anymore, they'll move over to this area, So, we're all affected by our environment. That they find pleasing, painful, or threatening. And of course, if we find an environment pleasing, we're going to stay longer in that environment. We enjoy that environment. If we find an environment painful, we're going to want to get out of that environment. And if we find an environment threatening, we're also going to walk slowly towards the door. We're not going to want to stay in that environment. We like to be happy and healthy, as we should. So, that's where we're going to want to be. Behaviorists look for events that determine whether or not a particular behavior will be repeated. A pattern, you hear that talk about a pattern of behavior. If a behavior is repeated, then it's a learned behavior, and there might need to be some intervention to stop that particular behavior. Behavioral research focuses on associative learning, in which a mental link is formed between two events. Two kinds of associative learning are classical conditioning, and some of those study experiments were not so good, and operant conditioning, and some of those weren't so great either. We'll get into that later. Classical conditioning. The Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov, I'm sure we've all heard of him, devised experiments in which dogs learned to salivate at the sound of a bell that rang at feeding time. These experiments were the foundation for classical conditioning, in which a response, in this case salivation, to a stimulus, in this case the bell, is evoked after repeated association with a stimulus that automatically elicits it. And in that case, they were getting ready to get food. So, the dogs learned, they heard the bell, oh, food is coming. So they'd start getting a little drooly. They were ready for their food. The American behaviorist John B. Watson applied stimulus response theories to children, claiming that he could mold any infant in any way he chose. And now we're going to look into some, probably, if it's the one I'm thinking of, not so good studies. In one of the earliest and most famous demonstrations of classical conditioning in human beings, Watson set out to teach an 11-month-old baby known as Little Albert to fear furry white objects. Again, not such an ethical study. In this study, Albert was exposed to a loud noise just as he was about to stroke a furry white rat. The noise frightened him, and he began to cry. After repeated pairings of the rat with the loud noise, Watson reported Albert whimpered with fear whenever he saw the rat. So they conditioned this poor child that, anytime he saw this little white fuzzy rat, there was getting ready to be a loud noise and he would be scared. So, that's a shame in my opinion. This study suggested that a baby could be conditioned to fear things he had not been afraid of before. However, as we will discuss at the end of this chapter, such research could be considered unethical today. Yeah, I just said that. Classical conditioning is a natural form of learning that occurs even without intervention. By learning what events go together, children can anticipate what is going to happen, and this knowledge makes their world a more orderly, predictable place. So we learn to anticipate things and to predict what's going to happen next. That's why we got these big, nice brains. And, that's how kids learn about it. And it helps if kids have schedules. Like, they know it's getting to be, 11 o'clock. It's about lunchtime. Their teacher's going to say, okay, it's lunchtime. Let's go, get for lunch. And they know after lunch they're going to have, reading or art or whatever they're having after lunch. So, they learn to predict that this is what's going to happen. Operant conditioning. Baby Terrell lies peacefully in his crib. When he happens to smile, his mother goes over to the crib and plays with him. Later, his father does the same thing. As this sequence is repeated, Terrell learns that his behavior, in this case smiling, can produce a desirable consequence, which is loving attention from his parents. And so he keeps smiling to attract his parents' attention. An originally accidental behavior, the smiling, has become a conditioned response. And that's why it's also important to be consistent with your children, because once they get a response like this, they expect that every time. And you can disappoint them if that's not a thing. And if it's not going to be a thing, such as going somewhere, getting something, or, whatever, they're used to a certain way, you need to explain to them, well, this time that's not going to happen because, and then they'll even ask you, well, is that just this time? Is this going to always be the thing? A lot of kids will ask you questions like this. Is this forever? Is this always going to be a thing? Because they want to know. They want that security in their mind. So it's important to be consistent with children. And anyone else, really. This kind of learning is called operant conditioning because the individual learns from the consequences of operating or doing something to cause something on the environment. Unlike classical conditioning, operant conditioning involves voluntary behavior, such as Terrell smiling. The American psychologist B.F. Skinner, who formulated the principles of operant conditioning, worked primarily with rats and pigeons. But Skinner maintained that the same principles apply to human beings. So, he didn't do anything to any kids. Yay for him. He found that an organism will tend to repeat a response that has been reinforced and will suppress a response that has been punished. So think about that. Whenever you're reinforcing a behavior, you're saying it's okay. So when your kid is throwing a bloody fit in public, and wanting something and you give it to them, you've reinforced that behavior. You've told them, oh, okay, if I act like this is what's going to happen. So there are a lot of parents who are reinforcing bad behaviors in their children just because they don't want to deal with the fussing or arguing or whatever's going on. So they're reinforcing bad behavior just by not, being a good parent, and they will suppress a behavior that has been punished. So, when you're raising children, it's important to have rewards and punishments. They're on the same tree, both limbs of the same tree. Because anything you reward, and that can even mean just giving into them, you've reinforced. And anything you punish them for, you've taught them that that's not something they want to do because they're going to get punished. So think about that. Reinforcement is a consequence of behavior that increases the likelihood that the behavior will be repeated. So, like I said, anytime you're reinforcing your kids' bad behavior by giving in to them, it's more likely it's just going to keep. It's going to keep up and maybe even ramp up worse. So, that's like people like Super Nanny. Like I used to do a child psychology program when I was doing life coaching, where I'd go out to the home and watch what's going on and say, okay, this is a problem. This is what you need to do about this problem. Here's how we can take care of this. In Terrell's case, his parents' attention reinforces he's smiling, which is a good thing. Punishment is a consequence of behavior that decreases the likelihood of repetition. And there are people who will spank babies for crying. Now, a baby can't talk to you. It can't speak to you and tell you what's wrong. It only can cry to tell you something is wrong. So if you're punishing a baby for crying, you're basically telling it, it's not okay if you're hungry. It's not okay if you're thirsty. It's not okay if you need to go, have your diaper changed. It's not okay if, a big spider crawled up in your bed. I don't care. I don't want you to cry no matter what. And that's what this child learns. So then this child cannot effectively get its needs met. And if the parent is a negligent one, they might not get their needs met. And then you can have an underdeveloped child, failure to thrive, death even. So, that is not a good thing. Punishment needs to be reasonable and have common sense involved in it. If Terrell's parents frowned when he smiled, he would be less likely to smile again. Whether a consequence is reinforcing or punishing depends on the person. What is reinforcing for one person may be punishing for another, because you have different personality types. I have family members who are on the spectrum. When I smile and talk to people, they come to me and want to smile and talk to me, and they might even give me a hug or, whatever. To these people, they would not necessarily want that. They would not, they smile and someone came over to grab them and touch them, and no, they don't want that. So, again, everyone's different. So, what you like is not necessarily what someone else might like. So, you have to keep that in mind. For example, for a child who likes being alone, being sent to his or her room could be reinforcing rather than punishing. I always liked playing alone in my room. I had no problem with that at all. Reinforcement can be either positive or negative. Positive reinforcement consists of giving a reward, such as food, gold stars, a bonus, or praise, or playing with a baby. And, some girls love that. They want to play, with their little brothers and sisters and, help out with the baby. But other kids don't want that. So, but we had a tally chart where they would get good checks and bad checks. I started out with stars, and then it got hard to buy stars at the store anymore. So, they would get good checks and bad checks. And the reward was their allowance, up to a point where their father kind of was not being great and kind of took that away, and that changed their behavior a little bit, honestly. But they would get, a certain amount of money, like 10 cents for every good tally. And then for every bad tally, that would take that away. It would take 10 cents away. So at the end of the week, they had X amount of money. It usually added up to like $1 or $2 or whatever. Because we would ask them, their goal was their chores. They had to do their homework. Each of them had a job or two to do. And this was to be done before family time, at 8 o'clock when everybody would sit down and watch a show or, whatever before the baths started. And so they learned that if they did the good things and didn't do bad things, that was more of a reward for them, because then they got more money to spend at the Dollar Tree, which they loved to do when they were younger. And then as they got older, it was more like Walmart. But they learned that their behavior did pay a consequence in how their life went, and that's important. Negative reinforcement consists of taking away something the individual does not like, known as an adverse event, such as loud, raspy noise. Now, that is in a case they're talking about here. But like for my kids, if there's an argument over the toy went away. Went away for a day until we could have some agreement on things. If there was abuse with a toy, because sometimes kids get mad, they'll throw a toy at each other. That toy went away, for at least a week. It did not come back because that's not okay. That's not happening. And then they also had to be, in timeout. So, you got to teach your children. And that's a problem a lot with parents in this current age, is they don't want to take the time to teach their children, to raise their children. And that's why we're having all these grown adult children out in the world just doing whatever they want to do, because they never learned any better. Negative reinforcement is sometimes confused with punishment. However, they are different. Punishment suppresses a behavior by bringing on an adverse event, such as spanking a child or giving an electric shock to an animal, or by withdrawing a positive event, such as watching television. Negative reinforcement encourages repetition of a behavior by removing an adverse event, and that is used in a lot of, conditioning. Hopefully, no one is doing this with their child. That's, in my opinion, to scare a child like that, that's not okay, in my opinion. When a toddler in the presence of toilet training tells his parents he has soiled his diaper, the removal of the smelly, sticky diaper may encourage the child to signal again the next time he has an accident. Now, one of my children, they were potty trained by the time they were 18 months. They quickly learned they didn't like to feel that on them. So they would take their own diaper off in the early morning hours, throw it out of their bed. So sometimes they would make another mess in the bed, sometimes they wouldn't. But they learned that they didn't like this dirty diaper on them. Rather than, yell for help, they figured out, I can pull this tape, I can get it off, and throw it out. And so they did. Reinforcement is most effective when it immediately follows a behavior. If a response is no longer reinforced, it will eventually be extinguished. Meaning, if you no longer reinforce that behavior, eventually they'll quit. That is, return to its original baseline level. If, after a while, no one plays with Terrell when he smiles, he may not stop smiling, but will smile far less than if his smile still brought reinforcement. And that would be pretty sad for poor Terrell. Got a fuzz here. Behavior modification, or behavioral therapy, is the use of conditioning to gradually change behavior. And that's what some people go to therapy for. They're behavioral therapists. And if you know you have a problem behavior, you might want to go talk to one. And they will teach you how to change your behavior. It can cut down on the frequency of a child's temper tantrums and increase acceptable substitute behaviors. It is effective among children with special needs, such as autism, and among persons with eating disorders. So, even if the person isn't the most intelligent person or astute, the behavior modification therapy can help them. Social learning, social cognitive theory. Bleh. The American psychologist Albert Bandura developed many of the principles of social learning theory, whereas behaviorists see the environment acting upon the person, as the chief impetus for development. Social learning or social cognitive theorists to believe that the impetus for development comes from the person. So they believe that not the environment by itself causes certain behaviors, but who you are as a person and in the environment. And of course, that's got some truth to it too, because a more negative child might have more adverse reactions than a more positive child. It all just depends on who you are. Classic social learning theory maintains that people learn appropriate social behavior chiefly by observing and imitating models. And that's why it's important for you to behave like a decent person around your kids. Because children learn what they live. And they see you, being bad, they're more likely to be. They see you being ignorant, it's more likely they will be. They see you being hateful, it's more likely they will be. They see you being indecent, it's more likely they will be. That is by watching other people. And that's how we learn. We learn from our friends in school, that they could do this, that, or the other thing, whistling, crossing your fingers or whatever. We all learned that from somewhere. This process is called modeling or observational learning. People initiate or advance their own learning by choosing models to imitate. So again, that's why we're supposed to act like decent people, because children are watching and they're going to imitate the people that they look up to. Say a parent or a popular sports hero. Imitation of models is the most important element in how children learn a language, deal with aggression, develop a moral sense, and learn gender-appropriate behaviors. So you usually learn your language from your parents and your immediate family in the house. That's the first language you pick up. That's what's called your first language. Another one would be your second language if you learned another language. And again, dealing with aggression. So you parents out there, if the way you deal with aggression is throw big fits and throw stuff around, your children are more likely to do that because they see you doing it. And a moral sense. If children are brought up with a moral sense of what's right and wrong, they're more likely to carry that. Like it says in the Bible, train up a child the right way he should go and he will not stray far from it when he's older. If you don't have a moral sense about you, then your children are probably not going to either. And gender appropriate behaviors. Now, having said that, we're kind of realizing that gender is not so, stuck as it should be. There are girls who like to play sports. There are boys who like to be, in fashion and things of that nature. So, not so much on that anymore. However, observational learning can occur even if the child does not imitate the observed behavior. They still saw it, they learned something from it, but that doesn't mean they'll necessarily do it, especially if it's not something that was reinforced, and especially if it was something that was punished. The specific behavior people imitate depends on what they perceive as valued in their culture. So if they think this is a valuable skill, like, most kids want to whistle, and most kids, learn to cross their fingers or whatever. If they perceive it as a valuable skill that's going to add to their repertoire of things they can do, then they're more likely to imitate it. If they look on it and it seems like this ain't for me, then they're probably not going to. So, it's all in your environment, all on what's going on in your life and in your culture. So that's where we're going to stop. And I hope that helped you figure out a little bit more of why you do what you do. Until next time.